The sea was black glass until it broke. Far below the Merlins, along the stone teeth of Eastwatch's outer pier, shards of ice rose and fell with the tide as if some slow beast breathed beneath the shivering sea. The wind carried salt and iron and the thin, almost sweet stink of whale oil. Jon Snow stood on the narrow wall walk with his hands tucked into his cloak and his breath turning to smoke in the air. Ghost paced at his heel, a white shadow in a world of grays and night. Beyond the harbor, a cold moon silvered the long line where water met the end of the world. At the far edge, where the sky touched ice, he thought he saw a darker shape move and vanish, like a thought half remembered. "Nice night for a sail," Cotter Pike muttered. The commander of Eastwatch by the Sea had the look of a man perpetually annoyed to find himself still alive. "If you fancy getting your arse bitten off by a floe." "You sent a raven," Jon said. "You said men you do not know traveled along the ice like ghosts and vanished at the fjords." Pike's lips twisted. Raven said more. "I said they left signs. I said 2 of my best men went after them and did not come back. Mind the wind, boy. It'll cut wishes out of your tongue." Ghost lifted his head. His pale eyes had the same watchful stillness as the men along the parapets. The wolf's breath blew plumes that drifted like smoke over the stones. The white of him made the night seem blacker. "They weren't wildlings," Pike said. "Not free folk I know, anyway. Not thens, not hornfoots. Walked like seals on the ice. Left marks like fish spines. Left other things. Charms, they said. Bone circles and red thread." He made a gesture in the air, tracing a loop then a crossing line. "I've seen that kind of work. Once." "Where?" "Wintertown, back when I was green as turnip stew. One of Lord Ricard's wars, or maybe the one before that. A Skagosi raider was hanged outside the old alehouse with some of those on him. The old woman what ran the stew cauldron said the island folk tie sights to bones, to tell the ice what to do." He snorted. "As if any man commands ice." "Skagos," Jon said, tasting the word. He had seen it on maps, a blunt gray shape in the Bay of Seals, hard and sharp-edged, the sort of place maps were glad to leave alone. Old songs named it a place of stone and storms and shaggy horned goats that some called unicorns. Old men named it a place of cannibals and oathbreakers. The truth, like most truths, lived in the cold between story and fear. Pike squinted along the moon road. "If they are who I think, they know this water better than seals and better than me. They don't come off their rocks for a kiss and a story. You know what lies up that way?" "The dead," Jon said. Cotter Pike glanced at him sidelong, as if measuring how much frost the boy from Winterfell had let into his bones. "Aye, we've seen lights upshore at night, and none of them are lanterns. The free folk who came through the wall last month. They spoke of the dead seeing with ice and hearing with silence." He spat. "I'm a sailor. I believe what keeps my ship afloat and what my best steelers say. And what I see with my own eyes." "What did you see?" Pike pointed along the coast, where the line of ice ran into the land and the land stood up like a clenched fist. "There's a cut in the world up there. The Skagosi have a name for it. They call it the Wolf's Mouth. It's a fjord so narrow a man can spit across it and not hit water, and it runs deep inland like a knife, and when the tide turns it grinds. You can hear it sometimes at night if the wind comes right. Like bones." Jon stared out into the cold. He thought of the dead at the fist of the first men, the ring of standing stones, the black cold in his lungs when he ran. He thought of a blue-eyed shadow in the trees at Queenscrown and a sword that drank the light when it moved. He thought of Mance Rayder, who had wanted to pass the wall rather than attack it, because the true war lay north and not south. He thought of a little boy with a shag of dark hair sitting on a toadstool thrown in a cold hall, but that was only rumor and a dream. "How many men can you spare?" Jon asked. Pike barked something that might have been a laugh. "From my dozens? What would you like?" He counted on his fingers. 3 are dead since your raven. 2 vanished. 9 with fingers enough for bows. Half a dozen who can stand in a line and not piss themselves. Some Queen's men left their red hearts on the wall down at the dock. They swear the Lord of Light will sweep the dead back into night. Not one of them can reef a sail. I can spare what I can spare. Why? Because if those are Skagosi scouts, Jon said, we need to speak with them before the dead do. The sea did not change its mind for men, but men could learn to ride its moods. Before the moon had shifted much, the harbor was a confusion of black water and blacker hulls and the whisper of rope against wood. Eastwatch was a place of rough hands and quick knuckles even in warmer seasons. Now it was a place of lanterns in the dark and men who moved like shadows between one fire and the next. Jon watched the longboat slide down along the dripping stone. Ghost made no sound. When the boat touched water, it did not splash. The boatmen left the line coiled in a neat sleeping snake and bent their backs to the oars. Tormund Giantsbane swung his great bulk down the last of the rungs, one hand full of iron chain. He landed like a sack of grain, steadied himself, and grinned his broken grin up into the wind. 7 hells, boy, Tormund said. If I'd known the sea tastes like knives, I'd have stayed to drink with your red woman. She's not my woman, Jon said, more weary than annoyed. Tormund grunted. Best this way. The gods and goddesses like who they like without asking. Have you seen this ice? Crawls like a living thing. It'd make a goat walk on its toes. He stared into the dark beyond the harbor. I've never liked water I can't drink. You wouldn't like what drinks it, Cotter Pike said behind them, and jumped down into the boat with an ease that belied his age. The oars dipped and rose. In the stillness Jon could hear the wood creak and the faint chatter of ice against the hull, like teeth. The longboat slipped past the outer pier and into the moon's wide gaze. At sea the cold came like a hand closing. Jon pulled his cloak tighter and let his eyes learn the water. He had learned the forest's breathing on winter hunts. Now he tried to hear the seas. The large movements were easy. The swell, the drift of slab ice like slate roofs being borne past a town. Beneath that, though, was a thinner voice. The hiss where little shards were ground to glass. The far groan where floes touched and the pressure worked on them like a slow mill. Ghost sat with his forepaws planted and his head turned toward the north. He did not huff, he did not whine. Jon read him better than he read his own heart. The wolf was listening. They let the boat drift once they were clear, oars held flat, blades ready to meet the water with the next breath. Men of the watch crouched along the gunwale. One of Pike's oarsmen wore a red cloth at his throat, tied like a priest. Jon felt rather than saw Tormund's bulk settle. They waited. At first there was nothing. Moonlight turned the world to blade and bone. The ice shifted and tore threads of cloud that had fallen to the sea. Then Jon felt rather than heard the change. It was a looseness, as if the air all at once had more room inside it, as if the cold were a mouth opening beneath the boat. Ghost's ears pricked. They came from around the shoulder of a floe, 3 figures in skins and rough wool, barefoot on the ice. One moved first, a woman by the motion and the long braid that slid beneath her hood. She held a bone horn in one hand. The other 2 carried together a narrow sled that looked like a rib cage turned upside down. The woman lifted her free hand. She had 3 fingers on it. She set the horn to her lips and gave one note, short and flat. The note seemed to vanish into the air rather than travel through it. Cotter Pike muttered something too low to carry. Tormund did not move. The woman knelt and traced a sign on the ice with a smear of ash from a little pouch at her belt. She did not look up. The men laid down the sled beside her. They were lean, built like whips, with hair in clotted ropes and faces too still for men who knew nothing of fear. The woman let the horn hang again from her wrist and raised both hands. Slow, like a prayer, she placed the 3-fingered hand and then the whole hand on the ice. Jon felt the cold reach his bones in answer. "Show your face," Pike said, and the wind seemed to carry the words and set them down where she was. She turned her head very slightly so that he could see the profile of her cheek, the bright knifed line of her nose. "We could hear your boat by the oil in the thole pins," she said, her voice a level thing with no tremor and no welcome. "You came quiet for men of the wall. You came loud for the dead." "We came for you," Jon said. "It is always for us when men come to Skagos," she answered and stood, and at last looked full at them. Her eyes were black and deep as holes in the snow. "Lord Snow." She did not make it a question. "I am Jon Snow. You are the wolf lord who opened the wall," said the man nearest her. He had a cutlass hemmed up in leather sheathing and teeth like old candle wax. "The one who wears a black cloak and speaks for a dead king." "I speak for the living," Jon said, and heard how the words sounded in the cold. "Aye." The woman's mouth bent in something too old for a smile. "Then you come to the wrong shore if you'd have only that answer." She tapped the ice with one bare toe. "Hear her." They were very still all at once. Even the longboat seemed to hold itself from creaking. The ice beneath them had a voice after all. Jon had heard the far groan. Now he heard the near, thin song beneath that, a sound like a lute string plucked with a bone finger far down in the world. "She speaks of weight," the woman said. "Of things coming." "The dead," Cotter Pike rasped. "The cold remembers them," the woman said. "We have been counting. We do not count like men of the south, with marks on a board or gold bits in a pot. We count what the ice tells us and when the tide turns and what the seals leave on the rocks. This tide is full of iron. Things will grind." Jon touched Ghost's ear and felt the wolf lean into his hand. "If you know what comes, then you know why we are here. We would join hands." He did not say alliance. He did not say oath. He had learned that here words blew thin and broke. The three Skagosi exchanged no glance. Yet something passed among them, as surely as wind passes over the skin. The woman stepped to the edge of the floe nearest the boat and let herself down to sit with her legs dangling above black water. She whistled once in the same short, low way, and a long, narrow skin boat slid out from behind the floe as if the sea had grown it there. The second man guided it along with a paddle cut of whalebone and driftwood. The third leaned out and steadied it with his hand. "Come if you will," the woman said, "but no iron in your palms and no fire in your mouths." She glanced at Tormund's bearded face in the dark and then at Jon. "Leave your glass where it sits also." "Obsidian," Jon said. "Dragon glass." "We know what it is," she answered. The corner of her mouth flickered. "We know what it does. It angers them. They see it. Leave it behind if you want to talk at the fjords and live long enough to do more than spit words." Cotter Pike grunted. "I've never liked putting down a knife in the dark." He unclasped one of the small knives at his belt anyway, shrugged, and slid it under the plank by his foot. Tormund lay his spear to rest along the ribs, patted it like a sleeping babe, and let it lie. Jon unstrapped the small leather quiver where he kept the heads wrapped in wool and set it beside Longclaw. For a moment his hand sat on the black, rippled steel. Then he drew it back. "What do I call you?" he asked the woman. "The ice knows what to call me," she said, and slid her three-fingered hand along the edge of the floe. "If you need a men's name, say Razan Crowl. I have Crowl blood, and my mother ate goat in the deep winter like any good woman of Deep Down, and my brother lost his fingers in a hunt for a horned bull that rightly belonged to House Magner. We did not always keep the old ways, but the ice kept them for us." "Crowl," Jon said. "Deep Down." It was a name from Old Nan's voice and from tired ravens and from Wyman Manderley's fat lips telling a broken night to sail into stories. It was the sound of rumor made flesh. "We have little liking for Stain," the second man said, as if that mattered in the same way as wind and tide. "Stain takes too much drift and calls it right. Magner takes girls as if they were lumps of blubber to be split. But this is not that talk. Come, Lord Snow. Come up the wolf's mouth and hear how it opens and closes." They could not bring the longboat into the skin craft without swamping and drowning, so they left her rocking in a trough between floes and moved one by one like ghosts between water and night. Ghost leapt from the boat to the floe and made no mark. He looked back once at Jon and then forward into the cold. Jon envied him the simplicity of that motion. Men carry what they have been told. Wolves carry their bellies and the scent of now. They followed the Skagosi across a chain of floes that looked like a necklace of cracked plates. Their bare feet found purchase where Jon's boot soles slipped. He learned quickly to test each sheet with his weight and then slide rather than step, to keep low, to let the sea beneath and around him be a thought and not an enemy. It was like learning a new sword in the hour just before dawn. He thought of Donal Noy and of the old man's cold eye when he had handed him his first steel. "You think it's the sword that wins," he had said. "It's the man's legs. Don't forget your feet." The fjord showed itself first as a dark line in a darker world, a black cut rimmed in wind-sculpted snow. Above it the land reared up in shadow, but Jon felt that more than saw it. The air changed there. It grew stiller and colder. A breath held. The woman they called Roseanne whistled again, and other shadows answered, moving along the lip of the cut. A rope of sinew and spun gut came down into the shadows and then up toward them. No one spoke. Jon felt the old boy in him, the one who would have named everything in a hall by pointing, die a little more. This was not the god's wood of Winterfell, where wind combed the leaves and the heart tree watched with red eyes. This was the world's mouth. They came to a ledge where the snow had been pounded hard by many feet in patterns like scales. Here the fjord narrowed, and the walls on either side rose abruptly in blue-black plains that both took and gave back the moonlight. The water down below moved like something that had never learned to be water. It climbed and fell with the pulse of the sea, but not the same way a harbor does. Pressed and released. The sound it made was not water's sound. It was stone and old wood under the hands of a man who knows the joints. Men and women stood along the ledge like stones themselves. They wore sealskins and wool, bone piercings and bits of red thread. Some had their hair bound in high loops, some let it hang. Some had shaved half their heads so the wind could find their skulls. One wore a belt of horn. Another had a long knife of obsidian but had wrapped the blade from hilt to tip in sealskin, as if to keep it from seeing. A few of them were mounted on creatures the South would call unicorns. Shaggy gray beasts no taller than a horse's chest, each with a single long horn that thrust forward and then up like a death. Their hooves were splayed like a goat's, and they stamped with patience, their breath blowing like smoke. Jon felt a tug of something very old inside him, older than words and older than houses. It had the taste of iron and milk and storms. He did not trust it, but he did not spit it out. The oldest of the figures stepped forward. He was thin to the point of rope, his skin gray-brown and his hair gone, but his eyes were black and bright. He wore around his neck a collar of narwhal tusk worked into a circle and bound with red thread and something dark, maybe old blood. He spoke and the wind seemed to bend to hear him. "Lord Snow," he said. His northern accent was thick and had a rhythm different from Winterfell. It had more stone in it. "I am called Eric of King's House. If you need soft sounds, say Magner. We do not always wear that word easy, but we remember it." "Magner," Tormund snorted under his breath. "Old word. King and lord and father and knife." Eric's eyes moved to Tormund with no surprise. "The free folk used to call you husband to the bear." "They call me a great many things," Tormund said cheerfully. Eric looked back to Jon. "We watched your wall open. We counted your people and ours moving south. We smelled your oil fires and your horse piss. The ice counted too. She told us the dead are moving as water moves when the moon commands it. We would not have come to you if that were all. But we watched something else." "What?" "The dead learn. They are not just an avalanche. They have hands in them, lights in them. They send feelers. They come into our fjords and stand on the shelves and try to find where the ice will crack." Jon's fingers found and then unfound the knot of his cloak. "And you? What did you learn?" The Magner bared his age-yellowed teeth in something that was almost humor and almost not a face anymore. "We learned to tell the fjord when to close its mouth." Cotter Pike snorted. "And you'll tell it to swallow the dead. We have done it with walrus and with raiders from Carhold and with free folk who thought to take what does not belong," Roseanne Crowell said, her voice flat. "But we did it with a few. Now we must do it with more. The ice does not love the dead. We can make her choose to crush them." "Tell me how," Jon said. Eric put his narrow hand on the rim of stone and leaned over the black below, listening. "This cut goes all the way into the land," he said. "In spring it runs with melt and the seals come inside to have their pups because no orca's jaw can find them here. This is winter. The sea comes in and out over the shelf here. When a flow crosses the mouth at slack tide and the water falls, the flow sits like a lid. When the water rises, the flow lifts if it has no weight. But if it has weight, he made a motion with his hand, a slow grinding. If it has weight, the flow will catch against the stone and we can break it. When it breaks, it presses down and the water shears up, and the mouth takes what is on it and pulls it into the throat. At the throat, we cut. Cut what? The ice itself, Razan said. Not wide, not long. We do not hack like fools. We find the knuckle. Every fjord has one. A place where the old ice and the young ice meet and do not make friends. That is the knuckle. If we crease it, it will break when weight comes, not before. Then the tide makes a hand. The dead do not swim. They sink. They would get up and climb again because they do not breathe like men. But the fjord has places where the sea runs like a strangler's fingers. We put our knives there too, under the ice with stone. You saw white shadows, Jon said softly, thinking of the clearing north of the fist, the sound of glass. We saw men who do not move like men and horses that do not piss steam, Eric said. We saw eyes that see like you would think only winter sees. We have arrows with glass heads. We have iron, but iron is nothing to them. We have horns. We can sing the seal nets closed. But if we bring them all into the throat and call down the tide, maybe their hands cannot reach our hearts. This is not a battle you win, Razan said. Not the end of it. This is a slowing, a teaching. We teach the dead that the shore eats as well as the sea. Teach the dead. Jon felt the old heaviness returning between his ribs, as if something he never asked to carry had wrapped itself around his lungs. He thought of Maester Eamon's soft voice at night and the way the firelight made his eyes look like deep cups. Kill the boy and let the man be born. He thought of the boy he still carried and of the man he was still becoming and of the cold world that did not care. How many? He asked. How many do you bring? Eric countered. Cotter Pike had never been much for courtesies. He spit over the edge and it steamed in the dark briefly before the cold took it. Not enough. I can give you men who won't run and men who know a rope from a bowline and men who can stand when the ice moans. I can give you 12 with bows and 15 with axes and another handful who can haul and cut without losing fingers. I can give you boats. But I can't give you knights and their shining horse piss. We don't need shining, Razan said. We need men who can listen. She lifted her chin toward Jon, appraising him as one might appraise a seal before deciding where to strike. And we need a wolf. Ghost stood very still. The white of him had taken on shades of blue here, the fjord giving him back a color he did not claim. He did not growl and he did not wag. He watched the water and the mouths that were not mouths. Ghost is mine, Jon said. And the ice is ours, Razan returned without heat. And the dead are everyone's. We won't steal your wolf. We will ask him to do what wolves do. If he howls where we tell him to howl, the dead will turn their faces. They remember sounds better than men do. Tormund chuckled. I like her, he said loudly, and shook himself like a dog. She spits like a north wind and steps like a goat. So, Lord Snow, we send the dead into this mouth and break their teeth. Then what? Then we do it again, Jon said. At another mouth, and another, and we use that time to send word to White Harbor, to the Barrowlands, to Last Hearth. We tell them the way of it. We tell them to make the sea their ally while it is still water. We build fires where there are men to keep them, and we keep moving. We do not stand and let the dead choose where to eat us. Eric's thin mouth quirked. You have the seal's mind. Always with you the next hole in the ice. Winterfell will listen to you? Razan asked him, and for a breath the words hung between them and cut him as surely as any knife. Winterfell. House Stark. Honor. Snow. He imagined Catelyn Stark's face, then pushed the thought down. The North was not a single voice anymore. It was 100 voices speaking into a storm and hoping to hear their own words back. My name carries farther on the wall than beyond it, he said. But there are men who will listen to the watch because they remember the old oaths. There are others who will listen to fear. I will use both. And Stannis, Cotter Pike said, his voice carefully neutral in the way of men stating a loaded thing. And his queen and her burning god? Stannis is at the wall because he remembers something too, Jon said. He remembers kingship as a duty. I cannot make him or his queen do anything. But the men who call themselves his can haul rope like any other and will keep their feet if fear does not take them. Rhysand cocked her head. We will not wait long for your arguments to end, she said. We count the tides. We do not count the way you do with your parchment and crow scratches. When the tide falls tomorrow, the mouth will be ready. If you are here with your men, we will show you where to stand. If you are not, we will sing our own song. We'll be here, Jon said. It felt like a coin he could not afford and spent anyway. He knew what it meant. He would have to move men in the dark and in the cold. He would have to pry boats from fingers that had grown to them. He would have to go back to Eastwatch and make the small and stubborn kindnesses of men yield to a larger and colder need. He would have to ask some to die who had already thought themselves spent. Eric watched him as if he could see the coin pass from Jon's hand to the cold. Bring your glass too, he said in a softer tone. Wrap it. Keep it blind. They will come to see what we do, the ones with eyes. They will feel the anger in the glass like sharks feel blood. When they come and find no easy mouth, we will give them something to chew. Your sword, Lord Snow. What is that? Valyrian steel, Jon said. Long claw. Rhysand's eyes went to the sword's hilt, the white wolf's head. Old iron that drank fire, she murmured, almost to herself. Good. Then you bring that and the wolf and as many hands as can be taught to hear the ice. We will bring the fjord. She made the sign again, a bone circle traced on the air in soot, and turned away into the shadowed ranks of her people. On the way back across the flows, Tormund said nothing for a while. Then lightly, cannibals. Ha! These ones are so skinny they'd carve you a sliver and call it a feast. They don't waste, Jon said. No, Tormund agreed. Maybe we'll learn something. He lifted his face to the moon. Ah boy, this is the part where we see who dances and who slips. They moved like thieves through the rest of that night, stealing hours and men and ropes from the edges of sleep and warmth. Cotter Pike cursed and hustled and cursed again and made lists in his head without quills. Boats that could go did go, loaded with axes and rope saws, with stone weights, with casks of oil that breathed in the cold like uneasy beasts. Men who had never seen Skagos swore oaths to a wind they had never felt. Men who had hated free folk last week leaned bows and blades on the same rack as Skagosi. No one laughed much. Jon found Dolorous Ed by a stack of nets arguing with a Queen's man about the nature of rope. It goes around the boat, Ed was saying in his flat, despairing way. When it doesn't go around the boat, we go around the bottom of the sea. That's not the sort of around I like. The Queen's man opened his mouth, closed it, and walked away. Lord Snow, Ed said when he saw Jon. Did I do something to a god I didn't like? Or is this all one of my dreams? I had one where the sea was made of soup once. It was better than this. You're rowing north, Jon said. Find a bellyful of porridge and gloves that fit. And tell Gren to stop teasing PYP with the horn. He's not teasing, Ed said mournfully. He thinks the horn belongs to him. He isn't wrong. It was lying there and had his name on it in my head. The only other thing that ever had his name on it was a laundress, and we all know how that ended. There was soap and a grandmother. Not in that order. He glanced toward the sea. Will I want to look my mother in the eye after this? She'd have been proud, Jon said, and meant it. Ed blinked, as if a snowflake had fallen into his eye that he could not reach to brush away. Go, Jon said, and Ed went. By the time the gray that isn't daylight came creeping into the night, they had enough. It never felt like enough, Lord Commander or no, but he had learned to hear the sound in his heart that said now. He listened to it. He let go. He stood on the longboat's planks and watched Eastwatch shrink into a broken line and then to a shadow. Past the worst of the flows, past the chop line where the sea had broken and refrozen, toward a mouth in the shore where the breath rose and fell like a sleeping thing. At the fjord, the world had become a workshop. Under Rhysand's sharp eye and Eric's listening ear, Skagosi men and women and watch brothers together had set ropes in patterns that looked like spider webs in frost. They had cut along the knuckles with saws that hummed like bees. Careful, careful. They had dragged stones out along sleds laid on greased bone runners and set them in places below the ice where Razan's three-fingered hand told them to set them. They had looped ropes through rings of bone set like anchor stones. They had built small fires far back from the edge with driftwood and seal fat, just enough to keep hands from breaking. They had sung under their breath in a language Jon did not know but whose cadence he understood, short, long, short. He heard the sea in it. He heard the net coming closed. When the tide began to fall, Razan stood at the rim with her horn and did not blow it. Eric crouched with his ear almost to the stone. Men halted what they were doing and checked their knots again. The sound of the fjords breathing grew louder, though the wind did not change. Tormund rolled his shoulders and spat. Cotter Pike did not spit this time. He drank the sound with his ears and did not speak. Jon had Longclaw at his hip, wrapped in a dark rag so that the moon would not see it. He had wrapped the dragonglass heads twice over and hidden them in wool. He felt Ghost at his back and then at his side and then at his front, moving like the shore's shadow. The dead came like a weather. They did not appear all at once. First, far down on the slick black plain that was part ice and part sea, there was a rippling in the dark, a change in the texture of night. Then came the shapes. Men, women, small figures that had been children, beasts with slow, stiff gaits. Some still wore the clothes they had died in, stiff with ice. Some were only shapes of frost outlined by the wind. They did not call out, and they made no sound except the whisper of feet on frozen water. They came with a deliberate sort of hunger. They did not hurry, because hunger that knows it has a meal does not run. Behind them and not behind them, Razan always said later that she never saw them arrive but knew when they were there, moved the cold within the cold. Jon felt that before he saw it. A tightening of the air, a brightness at the edges of his sight. He lifted his chin and saw, far back among the ranks, a figure pale enough to make the moon look dirty. Another near it. The air around them had a shape emptier than air. Eric's hand twitched on the ice. "Do not shoot until they step into the mouth," Razan said. She did not whisper. She spoke to them the way one speaks to a cask of oil in winter, slowly so it goes where it should go and not all over your feet. "Do not shoot at the front. Shoot so the ones behind come forward and the front has nowhere to stand but the cuts we've made. Do not let your fear make your hands clumsy." Jon drew in a breath that hurt. He took a step to his place on the shelf where the rope ran through bone rings. Men stood in pairs along the rim, hands on the lines that linked the stone weights to the ice knuckle. If he closed his eyes, he could see it in his head. The long floating plates near the mouth that would sit when the tide fell, the pressure building behind them, the knuckle sewn with cracks and undercut into a thin bridge. He could see the throat beyond where the water ran faster when the weight fell. He could see the cut stones sitting against the underside of the young ice, waiting to tear it when the knots were pulled. It was like a net set for the sea itself. Ghost lifted his head and, at Jon's light touch behind the ear and Razan's low sound, howled. The sound ran along the fjord and up into the head of the cut and back again, and it did not sound like any wolf Jon had ever heard, although it was his wolf's throat. There was something in it of the ice and something of the sea, and something like the voice that spoke through men when they let their houses fall away and remembered that they were animals. The dead turned their faces. It was a difficult thing to see from far off, but Jon felt it in the way their movement altered, their hunger stepping toward the sound that spoke to the oldest part of meat. The ones at the front took the first steps around and onto the long flows that waited like lips. "Hold," Razan said again, soft and relentless. "Hold and listen." They held. The dead moved. The first ranks came across the flow. The flow dipped and then sat, wedged on the shoulder stones Razan and hers had chosen. The tide was almost at slack. When it began to fall, the weight would come onto it like a hand. Arrows with obsidian heads sang from somewhere beyond Jon's shoulder. North side switches he could not see. They did not aim at the front. They struck into the middle and rear ranks, and where they struck there came that brittle, terrible sound like glass crying, and bodies that were not bodies smashed. The dead had no breath to scream, but they came on, and the ones behind pressed into the ones in front. By accident or anger, One of the arrows found the bright pale figure near the back. The obsidian head shattered on a sword of frost. The thing holding the sword cocked its head, almost playfully, and Jon felt the hair on his arms rise as if lightning had touched green summer grass. It was not lightning. It was absence. It was a thing in the world that treated the world like a lie. "Hold," Razan said, calm as a winter sunrise. The tide turned. The flow at the mouth dropped onto the shoulder stone and caught, just as Eric had said. It tilted, and the pressure behind it changed, and water began to move into the mouth. The dead stepped onto it, and the dead kept stepping. Even the ones who might have been able to read the ice in life did not read it now. Weight moved. Below Jon's boots the cut stones waited. "Now," Razan said, and the lines came up in men's hands. All along the rim the first stones dropped, yanking free from their nests and pulling the under-ice lines taut. Jon felt the rope leap like a living thing in his hands and then move with heavy purpose, and then a shock as the first of the under-ice anchors tore through the young ice's belly. The fjord made a sound then that silenced thought, a long roar like breath leaving a colossus. The knuckle creased where they had cut. The flow broke. The mouth opened its teeth. Everything that stood on it dropped. The fjord took the dead into its throat. Water surged up, met by new water coming behind, and the grinding began. Ice against ice, stone against ice, bone against stone. The dead that fell tried to climb and found knives. They dragged at one another and found nothing to hold, because the ropes had been set to strip away whatever might have stuck. Some of them crawled, slow as lice, and found the second cut where the under-ice anchors made the young ice into a net that did not want them on it. There the net tore new holes. Razan blew her horn once then, just once, the low flat note. At the sound, pairs of men and women threw more lines and more stones. Others tipped oil casks where the falling water surge would carry the slick down and then up into the press. When lamps touched that oil, fire ran not as fire really runs, but as if fire had been taught to move like black water. "They don't drown," Tormund said hoarsely somewhere near Jon's shoulder. "They don't die right. They don't breathe," Cotter Pike corrected through clenched teeth. "But they break." The ones at the back did something like panic. It was not panic, because panic comes from life and fear. It was an old reflex in meat, perhaps, turning away from an "I do not know this." Those at the back turned aside and then turned back, drawn by the wolf's voice or the old mind that wants once it wants. That gave room for the ones at the front to climb. They began to claw up along the sides where the mouth's teeth rose, out of the throat. There were not many places like that. Razan had chosen them. She had set her silent knives for the climbing places. Arrows found the climbers. Where the arrowheads were iron, the arrows pinned and then were useless and then gone. Where they were glass, the climbers shattered, and where they shattered they dragged others with them down into the press. Ghost howled again, and this time the sound was joined by others, low and far, as if the fjord itself had answered. Maybe there were wolves in the high dark above Skagos. The sound did not feel like wolves. It felt like a seam in the world being pulled tight. Then the pale shadows moved. They did not come all at once. The air got thinner again, and anything that breathed felt it. Jon took a step to meet it without meaning to. His feet knew things his head had not agreed to yet. The first of the others came into clear sight where the light of a low lamp and the shivering moon met. It stepped lightly on the ice, and where it stepped the thin frost thickened and mended, and a skin formed over water that should have been too rough to hold. Its sword drank the light around it, but the places where light fled were not shadow. They were a hard, blue-white knot color that made his eyes ache. "Keep the glass for them," Razan said. She looked from man to man, and one by one the archers unwrapped the cloth around the obsidian heads. The others moved as if there were a floor in the air 2 inches lower than the one the rest of creation was given. They neither hurried nor slowed. Another came after the first. Jon counted 3, then 4, then more that were not yet in the light but could be felt. He took a step forward and his hand went to Longclaw's hilt, and it burned his cold palm like something alive. "Don't get clever," Cotter Pike grunted. "You aren't the wall, and that's no moat." "I know what I am," Jon said. "Good," said Tormund and grinned. "Because you look like a fool to me anyway." Then he lifted his own double-bit axe and rolled his shoulders as if preparing for a story and a dance rather than a fight that would put him in a cold ground. "Ah well, we were all born to die, lad. Let's do it before the bells of the free folk start singing for me." The first of the others reached the lip of the fjord and stepped onto the new skin that had formed over the water's churn, and the treachery of the ice knew no time. Where Jon would have gone down to the waist in black water, the other's weight was spread, and his passage did not break the skin. Came on like a thought you cannot keep out. Behind it the dead shifted again, as if the passage of the cold thing through them had given them new wires. Two went into the throat and did not come up again. The other who stood at the lip turned its head slowly, like a hound scenting where a rabbit had run hours ago and under snow. It did not look at Razan. It did not look at Tormund. It turned until the edge of its blade caught the light and made it cry out softly, then turned farther and looked at Jon Snow. He drew Longclaw. The sound the blade made was like wind in winter grass and the old voice of the south in his blood. When he raised it, the wolf's head hilt shot a line of cold up his arm that made his teeth hurt. Something in the other answered that sound like flint speaking to flint. Then it came, and the first moment was a triumph of every muscle he had trained to be a thing that obeyed him. He met the frostblade not by trying to stop it because he could not, but by turning it aside, by putting his shoulder into the motion, by moving his hips and sliding his boots and letting the ice be his teacher, not an enemy. The impact of Longclaw against the other's sword was not the impact of metal upon metal. It was like the sound inns make when a door you did not know was there opens into night. It was like glass trying to share a thought with iron. The shock went down his arm and into his bones and told him things about winter, and he told winter things about steel. He was not purely himself in that exchange. He was Winterfell. He was Jeor Mormont's easy hand on his shoulder after a hunt. He was a boy with his father's blood and his bastard name and a sense that he did not have the right to do anything and therefore must do everything. They fought without words. It was not an even match and would never be, because the other had the patience of things older than men and the economy of motion of a hunter who knows his prey will come back to the same hole in the ice. Jon had only his body and the movements he had put in it until they were as much his as bones. He moved. He fell and did not fall. He let the ice carry him when he must. He let the stone take his weight when he had to stop. He learned the other's rhythm in 3 passes and broke it with his 4th. He was not faster, but he was more willing to be clumsy. He slipped, not as a mistake but as a gift to the other's arrogance. He paid for it with a line of cold pain along his forearm where the frost kissed through his glove. He returned the gift with a cut across air that found the other's thigh where you would not think a thigh was, and the blade made a sound like a bell struck once on a deep night. Where Longclaw kissed, frost came away like shattered glass. The other's head tilted the same way as the first time, curious. It slid back from him on ice that it made under its feet and came forward again. Behind it, Razan shouted a word that was not in the common tongue and men with bows loosed, and 2 of the obsidian-headed shafts struck a second other that had come up to the rim. One head shattered harmlessly. The second kissed the thing in the throat, if throat was the word, and the thing came undone like sunlight breaking frost. All the light in it went out at once. It fell into itself and left nothing that the ice wanted to keep. The first other looked there and looked back, and if anything could have changed its face it might have. It moved then without grace or hurry, not striking at Jon, but stepping to the side where the shelf narrowed and the ropes were clustered near. The thing's sword touched one of the bone rings and the bone cracked, not like bone cracking but like glass dying. Jon lunged to put his body between the other and the lines. He was not fool enough to turn his blade away. He kept Longclaw between them and sought an opening. The opening came the way he had been taught to make it. Not where the enemy gives you space, but where you make him think he has taken it. He feinted a low cut to the knee and drew the sword up in a curve that any man might have seen coming. The other moved his frost blade to meet it, and Jon let his wrists go soft at the last instant, so that Longclaw slid along and bit, not at the bind, but passed into the joint of shoulder and neck. There was a sound like a winter stream's edge being kicked by a boot. The other's head came around to look at him, not by moving its neck, but because its eyes had decided to face him. Then it shattered. Not like a pot or a pane. It slid into shards of cold that were smaller when you looked again, and smaller, until there was nothing but a smell like old snow. Jon went to one knee because the world had tilted and because his blood felt thick and because his own breath was loud. He raised Longclaw and the wolf's head glowed with moon. The fight had not ended. The dead still pressed, slower now in that mindless way that is still relentless. Another other had turned to face them, and this time it came on ice that thickened under its own footfalls more quickly than before, as if a lesson had been learned. The arrow flights found it in the shoulder and broke and showed it the shape of the fury in glass, and it turned from discomfort the way a man turns from a sandfly. It came along the rim as if the air there were a street. "Pull the second cut," Razan shouted, and lines that had been waiting leapt. Men grunted. The knuckle further back broke where they had weakened it. Behind the mouth the throat tore, and the water surged with a new violence. Dead went down and down again deeper, and the press redoubled. The other paused, just for the length of a sigh. In that pause Ghost leapt. Jon neither thought nor shouted. He had not commanded his wolf to do that. Ghost did not ask. He flew, not like a dog but like something made of winter, his silence a song of its own. The other stepped aside, light as blowing snow, and Ghost hit ice that was solid for one heartbeat and then not. He fell to shoulder deep and scrabbled and found purchase and came up. Frost formed on his fur instantly, and he shook it off in a glitter like stars. The other's blade came down, not at Ghost, but at the rope nearest Jon, because that was the thing that would count most. Jon moved to meet it and missed by inches. The frost edge cut the rope clean and the weight behind it fell useless. The net under the young ice let go at that place and the water changed its mind, in a way Jon could feel in his teeth. He thought of all the ropes and the way they ran and the way the fjord had been taught to be a hand. He thought of the cut that would not hold if two more lines went slack. He moved without seeing because he had seen enough nights like this in smaller ways to know what direction the snow would blow. He threw himself bodily onto the lines that remained. The other's head turned toward him, the way a man might turn toward a lamp that had flared unexpectedly. The frost blade came up at a short angle. Jon's world narrowed to one thing: the movement of his wrist, the balance of Longclaw's blade, the slickness of the ice under his boot. He let his feet go where the ice told them, not where his head told them, and put the flat of the Valyrian blade along the other's cut, not minding the bite of the cold that came through leather, and slid it aside with his shoulder and hip. The frost blade kissed the stone in the rim, and the stone gave a little, as if reluctant to admit that it could be a thing that yielded. The other pulled back. Jon followed, because that is what the living do. They joined it, the living. Tormund with his laugh like a grouse hen's call, Cotter Pike with his jaw set, Skagosi men with knives wrapped in sealskin to keep the sight of the glass hidden until it saw what it must see. Razan with her horn between her teeth blew one flat note and then another, and though there were no seals in the fjord today, the sound might have been for them anyway. The dead that had not been eaten yet by the throat turned at the sound. Some fell simply because there were too many on the ice and not enough ice that wanted them. One of the unicorns stamped and stamped and stamped again, and where its horn struck it left a clean divot as if a human craftsman had chiseled there in warm daylight, and then its rider threw her lance, which had an obsidian head, and the other nearest it unraveled. "Keep the wolf howling," Razan said, and Jon did not know whether she spoke to him or to Ghost. Ghost howled, and the sound made hair lift along Jon's arms in a pattern like frost. He wanted to laugh. He wanted to cry. He did neither. He moved with the lines in his hands until the knuckle held again. He felt it, a delicate thing, the way you feel a small child's fist close around a thumb. Then the wind changed. It came not from the sea now but down from the land. A colder thing if that could be, carrying with it a smell like spent snow, like the inside of a cave that never has summer. It carried with it also a sifting of dry minute frost that would not melt. It was not common weather. It had a will. Jon tasted it and thought of the way the others had in them not just cold but intent. He realized, as his breath whitened faster and then seemed to go nowhere, that they were asking the same thing now the Skagosi had asked the fjord. "Make us a hand." The ice began to thicken, not at the mouth or knuckle where there was most movement, but in the pockets and the sills and the shallows and the old scars. The new skin on the throat became a membrane, then a film, then something that would hold a careful step. The others moved onto it with the confidence of spiders on silk. The dead behind them, the ones that had not yet fallen, came with them because their bodies knew how to move where the one with the will moved. "Break it!" Cotter Pike shouted, in a voice raw as rope. "Break it now." "We can't," Razan snapped. "We already cut where we had to cut. We have nothing to break that we have not broken. We can only make them stand where the ice will not forgive them. Listen, hear where it sings." She dropped to the rim again and put her ear to stone. Eric did the same 3 paces away. They both pointed at once, 2 fingers like compasses. "There," Razan said. "And there. Pull those and none of the others. If you pull them, the throat will spit and take the corners with it." "Who pulls?" Tormund said, panting. "I do," Jon said, and dragged himself along the rim toward the lines Razan had marked. Men moved to help him. He shrugged them off because he needed to feel the rope with his own raw hands. He did not want someone else's guess in his fingers. He wrapped the line against his forearm and heaved. It did not want to come. The frozen fibers bit into his skin. He pulled until his breath went out in white sheets and his shoulders screamed and his heels dug holes in the rim. And then the knot that had been so careful and so sly came loose. The weight fell. He felt it in his teeth again. He went to the second and did it again. The rope danced. The weight fell. The water under the ice jumped like a thing surprised. It ran, not as water is supposed to run, but as if it had remembered a purpose. The throat spat. At the corners the skin tore exactly where Razan's ear had told it would tear, and large pieces of ice, the ones that had let the others make their light steps, went away all at once. The thing that had been a floor became a lie again. The others moved with an inhuman quickness then, their grace turning to a speed that men cannot make with their hips. One of them failed, not because it stumbled, but because the ice refused him. He went into blackness and did not come up. Jon wanted to think a man had killed him. No one had. The fjord had taken its due, because men and women had asked it to at the right time with hands and rope, and the sea had decided to be generous. There were fewer others than he had feared the first time the dead had come, but even 2 are enough to break a line, and there were more than 2. The pale shapes moved to the rim and there, where the stone and ice met, sought the ropes and the anchors and the small, careful places where men had decided where the world would bend. One cut lines. Another brushed frost fingers over a knot and turned it into a lump of ice and struck it with the flat of a frost sword to shatter it. Skagosi with wrapped knives flung themselves at their legs, and one man paid with his life for something that had been his life last night when a frost blade found his chest, and he fell without a cry and did not bleed. Razan blew her horn again, and no seals came, but the sound gave a shape to men's movement, and they found their spots the way a net thrown in the right wind finds the sea's mouth without hands. Jon fought. He fought without the thought that would come later. He fought because his muscles had learned to think. Longclaw's weight and balance were his now. He used stone where stone wanted him. He used ice where ice would hold him and did not trust it where it was new. He struck at another knot because he believed he could kill it with a blow. He struck to bring its blade to a place where Tormund's axe could come from the other side, where the frost blade met the Valyrian steel and had to choose. He chose that place for it. He hurt. He should have frozen. He did not. Something changed again. It took him a moment to understand what it was, because it was both small and everything. The dead began to slow in a new way. Previously they had moved because movement had been given to them by a will that disliked the warmth in the world. Now they moved as if that will had looked up from them, as if it were listening elsewhere. The air did something at the edges of Jon's hearing. The rope at his forearm slackened as the press of bodies below eased. Razan stopped blowing her horn. Eric stood and turned his head toward the land and the higher fjords, the ones where the ice had not been taught to hold or break. A horn, not Razan's. Another horn, far up the cut, answered, and Jon realized he had not heard it until now because the dead had been too loud in their silence. It was a higher note and it warbled and it was followed by a crash, a sound like cliffs calving. Then another, closer. "The fjords!" Rizan said softly. The others. Not the others. She almost smiled and did not. They saw our fires. They heard our singing. We asked them to count and to tell their mouths to speak now. They answer. Cut after cut. Up along the coast, other mouths opened. The sea had gone down far enough now that the shelves all along the line of the island sat on their shoulders and waited for weight. And weight came because the others had sent the dead to test all shores. Where those shores had not been taught, men and women of Skagos were teaching them by hand tonight with knives and ropes and stones and songs. The weight fell through those mouths. Water ran. The sound it made came down the long corridors of ice and stone like a hymn. The others did not panic because they had no such thing. But they did turn their heads all at once like deer in a wood when the wind shifts and the scent of wolf slides along the ground. Jon felt it happen. He used that, putting his shoulder into the long plain stroke that brought Longclaw down and across, so that he had to meet less of the frost blade and the frost blade met more of him. He was the less hard thing and he still did not break. Where the Valyrian steel kissed the other again, nearer the hilt this time, the song of that kiss made the air bleed light. The other fell apart. The cold receded about 2 inches in the world. Tormund laughed and then coughed and spat something that may have been blood or may have been the last guts of fear. You broke him, he croaked. You cold bastard. You broke him like a bottle. Cotter Pike did not laugh. He looked older and more alive than Jon had ever seen him. We aren't done, he said in a voice that had no craft to it. We aren't done until we pull every line that will pull and cut every cut that will cut. And then we aren't done. He picked up a rope that had slipped and set it again and pulled as if he had 10 years less and a different life behind him. They were not done. They worked until the tide had fallen so far that the mouth would do no more for them tonight. They worked until men's hands bled through mittens and leather, until Rizan's 3-fingered hand had split at the palm and was all blood and ashen ice, until Tormund's beard was a white snarled growth with frost throwing sparks from it, and he had to break his face with his hands to drink. They worked until the dead that still could reach the rim could only do so one at a time and were knocked down by stones and broken by glass. They worked until the others left, and when they went it was not a retreat like men make but a slow turning away of winter, like a storm that takes another valley for a while. Only then did Jon feel the shakes in his muscles that he had kept away by a knife's blade. Only then did he know how cold he was. He looked down and saw the red at his forearm. He heard Ghost beside him breathing hard and saw the frost glazing the wolf's whiskers like decoration. He saw Rizan and Eric look at each other. Not relief and not grief, exactly, but a knowledge. He saw Cotter Pike squat where he stood and put his head in his hands for 2 heartbeats and then get up again, because men like him do not stay down when there is still anything with a rope to be hauled. They saw what the fjord had done when dawn did not come again but the gray went less black. The mouth had swallowed 1,000 and more. There were limbs in the water that moved when the water moved. There were bones that did not look like bones anymore because the sea had given them a gray sheen and a false softness. There were pieces of frost and strange ice left by where others had dissolved. There was a stink that was not exactly rot. It had salt in it and something old, like a cave where bears sleep. One of the unicorns had died, and the woman who had ridden it stroked its horn once and then cut its throat as cleanly as if it had been a goat, because they would not waste what the sea did not want. Burn what will burn, Rizan said. She had a voice left because she had been careful of it. Break what will not burn. Sink the rest if it floats. The fjord will pull then, when the tide runs up. She will take it out and the sea will swallow. Will it rise again? A young watch-brother asked, unable to help himself. Some will, Eric said, and there was no comfort like the South makes in his words. Some always do. The dead can learn. But the fjord learned tonight too, and we will not stop cutting. They will count us now. Here. He touched the bone collar at his throat. And there. He pointed toward the north, the wall, the long line of haunted forest, the rest of the world. Tell them we made a mouth. Tell them to ask their shores what they can do. They burned until a bitter snow began to sift down. It came not from the bright blank sky but from a gray that had no edge. They burned and they counted, and the counting did something in Jon that added weight and shape to his fear until it became a tool, a hammer instead of a stone in his belly. He moved among the men, not to make speeches. He put his shoulder to lines. He cut with saws where someone had to cut. He once tended a man's hand where the rope had eaten it. He tore cloth with his teeth for that. He did not think of himself as Lord Commander in those minutes. He thought of himself as someone who could make his hands do a thing. When at last the fjord had had its fill for now and the people had had theirs, Razan walked up along the rim beyond the fires. Jon followed because he was not done either. They stood in a secret in the gray, the sea breathing below them like a spent thing. Ghost sat and stared at nothing that Jon could see. Razan wiped her palm on her seal skin and left a smear that would not look different from a stain that had been there last year. "It will not hold them," she said. "You know that." "Yes. But it will teach them something. But it will teach us more." "Yes," Jon said, and was glad to be with someone who would look at the truth and not ask it to be less true. She studied him the way one studies the surface of ice for what it means about the water beneath it. "They say your father was Eddard Stark." "He was. They say also other things." Her eyes were not unkind. "They were not anything. You carry the wall in your shoulders, Lord Snow. You leaned into it tonight. That is good. But you cannot lean into it alone forever." "I have brothers," Jon said quietly. "And I have friends." "And you have enemies," she returned, matter of fact. "I do." "Here's the thing," Razan said. "The fjords learn tonight because they have mouths and because we have ears and ropes and knives. The dead learned because they are the kind of ing that learns. Men learned who can love and lie and pull lines and break. The sea learned nothing. She does not care. She only moves. If we keep her moving the way we ask and at the times we ask, she will be our friend until the day comes when she opens and takes us too. That is all right. We have to be food for something. Remember this when you go to your kings. They want the sea to be loyal. She will be only movement. That is enough." Jon stood with that in his bones for a while. It was a cold wisdom that warmed nothing and yet felt like a cloak he could put on. "There was once a boy people said had been seen on Skagosi," he said, unsure why he spoke it. "A Stark boy." Razan did not change shape in any way Jon could see. "People see many things," she said. "Some of them are wolves, and some of them are seals, and some of them are kings. We eat goat in winter. We grow potatoes in the dark. We do not eat children. You want a king? Go find him where kings are made. Not here in a place of mouths and knives and counting tides. If the boy you want lived here, we would have kept him safe because he belongs to the cold. Not because of what his name buys." She spat neatly into the snow. "Go ask your fat lord in White Harbor about boys and names. Ask him which he eats first." Jon almost smiled, because he had never liked Lord Wyman's fondness for speeches that were mostly food. "I will ask him for ships," he said. "Do, but not for burning. The sea will take fire, but she does not like it, and you will need the oil to keep fingers." Razan turned away. She was a small woman, made smaller by the great cold around them. But she seemed then as large as the places she could hear. "We will do this again tomorrow night if the tide allows. The dead will come. We will show them again that the mouth bites. You bring your men if you can. If you cannot, we will still bite." "We will come," Jon said. "And then I will go. I will send ravens to every lord who still has hands. I will ask Stannis to spare men and boats. I will ask the wildlings who crossed our wall to come stand on this shore and help teach the sea." "You will ask and you will not beg," Razan said. "No, I will not beg. And if they will not come, you will remember that there is a shore on your side as well." Eric's voice came, old and dry as driftwood. He had come up in their silence and did not apologize for it. "The Bay of Seals does not only lick Skagosi. The shore at Hardhome bites and weeps for men. Ask it too. Teach it. Teach all the mouths on your side how to be teeth." "I will," Jon said. They did it again the next night, and the next, because the sea lets you be brave until she asks a price, and because what else do men do but make pattern out of hunger and cold? Each time the dead came in different numbers and different moods, and each time the others came to test the edges where craft met old winter. They lost men because you always do. A queen's man with his red heart pinned over his own went down at the rim when a frost blade kissed his thigh and he bled inside himself and could not tell he was dying until he lay down and did not get up. A Skagosi girl whose hair had been shaved on one side went into the throat with a rope around her waist because a knot would not turn otherwise, and when they pulled half a body back. They sang for her as for a seal, because the sea does not care about your words, but it matters that you spend them anyway. Tormund took a piece of frost in the shoulder that made a white starburst scar and laughed until he cried when he woke, and then scowled because his tears had frozen his beard to his chest and he had to pour hot water over it to free himself. Cotter Pike did not smile for 3 nights and then did once, and it made men who had never seen that think the world had cracked. On the 4th night the wind came from the south before the tide turned, strange as a fox in a house. It brought a taste like smoke and fish stew. It brought with it sails, low and dark and wide, white harbor ships, their masts black against a small twice moon over the bay. They came because ravens had come and because there are still men in the north who will listen when a black cloak says the dead are counting. They came because Lord Manderley, whatever else he was, did not like being thought a man who could not keep a promise. In the morning a man with a belly like a barrel and hands like shovels came ashore in a leather jerkin trimmed with fur and bowed to Razan too deeply and to Jon too briefly, and paid for that with a look from Razan that would have made the sea itself step back if it had eyes. They brought rope. They brought oil. They brought chains. They brought men who had spent their lives hauling nets and hauling lines and pulling bodies that felt like stones from water in autumn. They listened quickly. They took instructions from people who knew better. They put their hands where they were told. They did not speak much of cannibals after the 1st night. On the 6th night a raven came with black wax and the mark of a burning heart, and the message said that Queen Celis had asked for prayers and had given nothing, and that Stannis had given permission for men to go where they would. Jon almost smiled at that too. Stannis's permission mattered less than the men's willingness. But such are the shapes of power in a world where even the sea needs a name before men will dare ask for its teeth. A handful of the Queen's men took off their red hearts and put on ropes. One, who had carried a torch for every burning the Queen had ordered, lit a small lamp and kept it, and used it to warm men's hands when their fingers broke. It is something, Jon thought. It is something that will be remembered. The dead did not stop coming. Sometimes they came in fewer numbers. Sometimes the others did not come at all, and the dead moved like a tide as any tide moves, and those nights they broke easier and bodies ground and were taken. Sometimes the others came in a way that said they were looking for a different lesson now. They would not step onto the ice near the mouth, but would send their dead through the shallows far along and bend them back like a rope. Razan taught the shallow places how to lie. Jon learned where to set small stones to make that lie into a bringing down when the weight passed. On the 9th night the wind died entirely, and the sea lay still as a widow. The dead came with the greatest number yet, so many that men stopped trying to speak of counting and spoke instead of eggs and fish and the many that came to their father's nets. The others came in a white line at their back like old kings on a tapestry, and the fjord learned how to bite a king. It did it slowly and with patience, because the tide had no hurry. Jon met an other that night on a narrow shelf, and they fought until his arm would not answer him. When he dropped his blade in his exhaustion, when it slid from his hand and clanged once against stone, the other raised its sword with the same calm as it had begun. His blade came down. Ghost leapt again. The frost blade kissed Ghost's back in a line that went from hip to shoulder, and for one breath Jon's heart died. Ghost did not. He turned in the air and sank his long white teeth into the other's arm where men have a place between 2 bones. He pulled and did not let go. The other lifted him without effort, and the wolf shook once like a snow-laden branch and the arm came away. At that, the body that had held the arm unraveled, and Ghost fell with it, and Jon found Longclaw because he would be a man who found it. Afterward Jon took Ghost into the shelter of a boat upturned on the shore. He laid the wolf there and poured hot water melted in an iron pot over the wound and set his own body around the wolf's body and told himself not to shake. Ghost's wound was terrible. It was also something he could understand. It was not sorcery. It was a cut that needed washing and binding and time. Razan crouched and touched the edge of it with her 3-fingered hand and said something under her breath that might have been a blessing and might have been a counting song. Ghost looked at her and then at Jon and put his head back down and slept, because wolves do not hold grudges against the world. It never becomes easy to watch the dead die. That was a lesson Jon had learned before and learned again each night here. It did, however, become something else. A work. He could put his shoulder into it as into a stone on a steep slope. He could imagine the north beyond this shore finding small fjords of its own. Streams they could dam and release. Low cliffs they could teach to be jaws. Marshes they could flood at the right hour. He could see 2 or 3 nights bought and a line of winter slowed. And in those nights men might get their children onto boats and across ridges and into farmsteads where fires still tell stories. He could make of that picture a thing like hope that did not lie to him. On the 12th night, the sea gave back something men had not asked of it. A body rode in on a floe and fetched up against the stones below the rim. He was not a watcher or a Skagosi. He wore a coat of fine cloth and a collar with tin studs and a ring that had the dim ghost of a sigil on it beneath the ice. He might have been a man of Carhold or a poor bastard lord of one of the fisher holds along the Bay of Seals. He had blue eyes as the dead do here, but his eyes were not the colder eyes. Jon stared down at him and did not know him. "Pull him out and burn him," Cotter Pike said, practical as a knife. "Wait," Roseanne said. She had come over and was looking at the man's hands. "He has the rope burn of someone who pulled in the right direction." "We all do," Cotter Pike returned. "He has them in both directions," she answered. "He was pulled and he pulled. He learned and unlearned. Burn him, yes. But the sea is telling you something. The dead aren't only what the others choose. They're also what we cannot keep." She looked at Jon without comfort or cruelty. "Remember it when you ask men for their sons. Remember what you will make when you lose them." Jon nodded. He did not say, "I know." He scooped oil in a cup and poured it on the dead man's chest and set it alight and watched it burn with the same attention he would give a knot. The lesson was not new, but each time it enters you it tears a little. They ground and burned and cut until the winter in him felt as heavy as the blade at his hip. And then when the tide would do no more and their own bodies could do no more, they left the fjord to breathe. It made a sound that men might call a sigh. Eric sat on a stone with his hands on his knees like a boy. Roseanne turned her face to the east and said nothing for a long time. Ghost slept and woke and ate and slept again, and he would not let anyone but Jon and Roseanne touch the bandage. "You will go," Roseanne said finally, in a voice that did not ask. "If you stayed, the dead would still come. The sea would still move." "I will go," Jon said. "I will go with boats to Hardhome if they can be found to carry me. I will go with ravens to Last Hearth and White Harbor and the Rills. I will put my face before lords who do not wish to see it and tell them what you taught me. And if they do as men do and argue about the shape of crowns, we will still be here counting tides," Eric said with a tired smile that remembered something beyond tired. "We do not eat crowns. We eat goat." Jon almost laughed, and then he did laugh, and the sound came out of him like a stick breaking in a forest. It was a good sound. It was a sound that meant he still remembered this. That life insists. They sent him with a boat that could find its way through ice in a blind night. They sent him with 3 Skagosi who had changed their minds once and would change them again as the day asked, who would fight men if that was what the ice wanted, who would eat goat and fish and little else and stand with his watch brothers on a wall of stone if they had to. They sent him with Roseanne's horn, because she said it had learned his wolf's voice and could say it back to him when he needed to hear it. At the outer pier at Eastwatch, where the ice made its small noises again against the pilings, Cotter Pike clasped Jon's forearm and did not say be careful because such words lie. He said, "Bring me rope," and Jon nodded because that was a thing you could do. Tormund hugged him in a way that cracked his ribs and then told him 10 bawdy stories in 2 minutes so that Jon would not think too hard about the way his eyes were too bright. Ghost climbed into the boat without being told and curled up and regarded the men there with the kind of patience wolves learn when they have been taught a man's pace. When they pushed off, the boat slid quickly along the moon road. Jon looked back once at the line of the wall. It looked less like a wall from here and more like a quiet cloud. He looked toward Skagos and could not see it. He held Roseanne's horn in his lap and felt the shape of its curve, the smooth places where it had been held 1,000 times. He put it to his lips and blew one thin flat note, and the sound did not go anywhere. It seemed to spread into him instead, and into Ghost and into the rope of the boat. He thought of the mouths along that hard shore, and of the hard mouths that were men's, and of the way you teach a thing to bite when it has been used to only chew. He thought of the dead trudging toward other shores. He thought of the others turning their heads in one place and then in another, listening for where the world would be weak. He thought of the knuckles in every fjord and in the knees of every man and in the small places in all plans where if you press, something will give. "Count the tides," he said aloud to no one and to everyone, and his breath smoked and went nowhere, and the next moment it seemed to fill the sail. When he reached White Harbor, Lord Manderley listened, and wiped his lips and listened again. He had ships ready because fat men in winter sometimes do their best work in the cold when the kitchen fires are low. When he reached the rills, the Redfords shook their heads at cannibal tales and nodded at rope. At last Hearth the Umbers hooted at unicorns and then asked three-pointed questions about the thickness of ice when new and the way a rope whistle sounds in a crack. He sent men up the long lake to teach its edges to lie nicely. He sent men to Bear Island because if anyone was ever going to teach the shore to bite, it would be a Mormont. He sent men to the Barrowlands because Barrow folk know what it is to be patient and to wait for an enemy to step wrong. He knew not all of it would hold. He knew the others would find places where men had not cut and not tied and not sung. Yet, when he stood on a low cliff near the Wolf's Mouth weeks later, a cliff that had learned to be a lip under Razan's hand, and when he looked down on a mouth that had again ground up a part of winter and spat it into a sea that still refused to learn, he believed something new. He believed not in victory, but in naming and in doing a thing again and again until it matters. He believed a wolf's howl can make the dead turn their heads. He believed a cliff can be taught to be a jaw. He believed that men who pull ropes in a line and do not let go when their fingers break are a kind of magic no sorcerer in a red robe can teach. On a night with no moon and a sky of scattered cold stars, he stood with Razan and Eric and Tormund on the rim again. No dead came that night. Sometimes that happens. Sometimes winter remembers that it can wait. They did not celebrate. They did not drink much. They sat and told small stories about goats with horns like hooks and a boy who had learned how to mend nets by mending his mother's hair. They told stories about a giant who had once drunk so much snow that he pissed an icicle, and about a ship that had gone out with a hole in it and arrived with no hole only to turn around and sink at the dock because the hole remembered itself. They told stories about men. None of those were soft. When the thin light not quite dawn came, Razan stood and stretched a back like a bow that had been strung too long. "There's a mouth near King's house that is jealous of this one," she said. "We'll teach it tomorrow. We'll teach them all," Tormund boomed, and then softer, "all that we'll learn." Jon tied and untied a small knot in a piece of cord that lay by his boot. He looked south, toward a land he both belonged to and did not. "There is a river mouth at Moat Cailin where the flints go spearing in spring," he said, thinking aloud. "It has mud banks that slide if you cut them right. It might be taught." He looked to the east, where the sea thought it was still alone. "There is a cove below Last Hearth. I remember fishing there as a boy with Rob and Bran. The rocks there have teeth if you ask them. They might bite if you feed them the right tide." "You sound like a Skagosi now," Eric said with a dry pride in it. "I sound like a man with a rope," Jon said. "And a wolf," Razan added. Ghost rose, shook, and stood with his white coat catching what light there was. He lifted his head at nothing Jon could hear. Then he began to howl, quietly at first, as if speaking to the cold stars, and then louder, as if telling the sea what it already knew. That it would move and move and move, and in that movement men would find places to put their hands. The sound ran along the rim and into the mouth and up into the cold world. It reached places Jon would never see and people he would never touch. It reached a boy somewhere whose name men argued about, and it reached a woman who had given away the last of her bread and a man with a red heart who had taken it. It reached a lord with a belly whose hands were still ready. It touched the wall and found it only a little bit less cold. It found the dead somewhere marching where there were no fjords, and made them tilt their heads, and in that tilt men moved, and in the moving there was time. Jon lowered his hand into Ghost's fur and felt warmth. He did not think about whether it would last. He stood with the smell of smoke and salt and old blood in his nose and the faint taste of ice on his tongue and thought instead of the next mouth and the next rope and the next cut. He thought of the sea as a teacher without mercy and men as bad and stubborn students and of the way sometimes, in winter, even a poor student learns a lesson well enough to pass one more day. They did not call it victory, because some words you do not spit on the ice in case the sound of them breaks it. They called it work. They worked. And now and again, in the gray that was not daylight, when the fjord closed its teeth and took another mouthful of winter, they allowed themselves to believe that for a while longer the dead would be kept to the water and the living to the shore. That, in this, was their parity with gods and kings. They had found a shape for the cold and put their hands upon it and said, "Here, here, here." And the cold had listened enough to make an opening for a man's next breath. When the next storm came from the north, it came with a different song. The men of Skagosi heard it, and the men of the watch who had learned to listen heard it, too. It sounded like ropes running through bone rings and like stones waiting to fall. It had in it the memory of Jon Snow's arms pulling against the line until his blood warmed with effort, and ghosts howl shaping a night into a tool. The storm would bring with it new things nobody had planned. That is what storms do. But the shore had mouths now. They had been taught. They would bite.